great being back in front of you all today. So we're going to be covering Esther chapter 5 and 6 today. So just to give a little bit of a recap to where we left off. So in chapter 4, so we left, the Jews were in trouble. The edict was brought up that essentially, Haman brought into effect this law of, hey, we're going to be able to get them all and wipe them all out, essentially, in the Empire of Persia. It was an empire-wide death sentence for the Jews. And when Mordecai found this out, there was the the great cry of anguish that came out, and he petitioned Esther to essentially petition the king in order to save them and to overrule this order that Haman gave. And it ended with Esther and her handmaids and Mordecai fasting. So, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to ask Bethany to come up and read chapter 5 for us, and then I'll continue on with chapter 6.
Esther chapter 5. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favour in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden sceptre that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the sceptre. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favour in your sight, in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfil my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So Haman went out that day joyful, and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet she prepared. And tomorrow I am invited again by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made.
All right, thank you, Bethany. If you all want to follow me through chapter 6 as well, starting in verse 1. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, Nothing has been done for him. So the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servants said to him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought to, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Afterward Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. A lot of stuff happened. I've got a lot of stuff to get through, so I'll try and keep this pacey, so as to not run over time or anything like that. But, first question. Kind of says there at the first verse of chapter 5, does anyone have like a power outfit? You know, if you need to feel confident, is there anything you put on to, some looks of confusions there. It says first of all, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house. So Esther's first task here that we see in the beginning of chapter 5 is that, as we saw at the end of chapter 4, she was tasked with this quite daunting idea of going to the king unannounced, possibly going in for the chop, and from what we've seen how the king has treated his previous wife, that is very much a possibility. So that's a pretty daunting task. So she gets there. He gives her the all clear. Says, okay, is there anything I can do for you? And she says, ooh, okay. So I'd like you to gather Haman and yourself, and we're going to have a little bit of a meal, and I'll tell you what my request is going to be. But when it actually comes down to it, she doesn't actually say what the request is at this first banquet. Instead, she says, well, come tomorrow instead to the second banquet, and I'll tell you what my request is. Cool. But to unpack that a little bit, for what reason, for all intents and purposes, she might have been ready when she initially strode in there to ask the king, hey, the Jews are in dire peril in Persia, please save them. But she backed away from that for some reason. I mean, we can speculate. It doesn't say exactly why. It could have been cold feet, could have been second thought, could have been, any number of things. Or could perhaps the Lord knew best of what else was going on in this situation. In general, there's this kind of concept of a coincidence, and people talk about, oh, this was a coincidence, that was a coincidence, or on the flip side, do things happen for a reason? It could have very well been that Esther didn't know at the time why she backed out, or I think everyone can possibly point to a time in the past where they go, I don't really know why I did that, or why did I do that? That didn't really make sense to me. But in any case, I think something that this kind of points out to us, and I'll do kind of like a mini so what that I usually do, kind of in the beginning here for us. Could it very well been that God was trying to nudge Esther in a particular way? We know that the fasting that Esther took part of, at the very least in that time, may not have equated exactly with prayer, but fasting would have certainly been a spiritual exercise for the Jews at that point. So one thing for us to think about is, how often do we perhaps stop and slow down and listen to God? Because God may trying to be telling us something that, in the hustle and bustle of life, we may not always be open to listening to. So again, we don't know what was running through Esther's mind, but we know that God is an active agent in the world, and, discerning God's will is a difficult one, even at the best of times. But to conclude the little bit that we have with Esther here at the beginning of chapter 5, in terms of discerning God's will, we could have a whole nother sermon series on that. That might be an idea for in the future, but in terms of discerning God's will, I think I would bring out prayer and Bible reading, because how else are you going to know God's will unless you know his qualities that are found in the Bible and you actually talk to him? So that kind of leaves Esther for the time being. So we have the first banquet that the king and Esther and Haman attended together. So what that brings us up to now is, if you come down to verse 9 with me in chapter 5, we have Haman. The focus of the story now shifts to Haman a little bit. So, what do we see with Haman? The first thing that's said about him. So beginning in verse 9 says, "So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart." He was probably riding on the clouds at this point. He had just gotten done with an exclusive banquet with the king and queen, which for a guy like Haman, who his obsession is with getting praise from people and being in that high position in court, and he cares what other people thinks about him. So that is what surrounds his core being. But immediately after that, what do we see? Continuing on in verse 9, it says, "But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai." And that's pretty intense. Filled with indignation against Mordecai. Why? Why was he filled with indignation against Mordecai? Did Mordecai, when Haman came into the king's gate, that courtyard area, did Mordecai shout over to Haman and heckle him and, throw insults? No. More than likely, Mordecai was probably just sat there, possibly talking to someone else, or just maybe even looked at Haman as he came in. So Haman's walking in. Perhaps other people did stand or tremble before Haman. But it's not so much that other people might have, it's that Mordecai did not. So all of a sudden, this burned, this intense indignation and probably anger against Mordecai. So, going on in verse 10, it says that Haman restrained himself. He restrained himself, and why possibly? So, Haman essentially at this point would have been second in command, second in position in court, just below the king himself. If Haman wanted to, he probably could have done something to Mordecai at that point. He probably could have, I don't know, done something physically to him, or gotten some trumped up charge to get the guards to come and arrest him, or anything, really. I'm sure Haman could have found something. But he didn't do that. He restrained himself, and what did he do instead? He went home. He went home, and he called for his friends, and he called for his wife. And what did he do then? Starting in verse 11. And then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. You know what that really sounds like? It really sounds like Haman's pride was hurt, and that he went home to his friends and family to get himself validated by people who would tell him what he wanted to hear. People who would tell him how great he was. How great he was. That would appeal to his pride. Appeal to his pride. His primary goal at the time was not to actually get revenge on Mordecai. And we'll see that changes as time goes on. But his primary goal at this point, the most important thing to Haman, was his pride, was what other people felt like him. He had to heal his wounded pride. Have you ever come home? Have you ever come home from work? I mean, my version of coming home from work now is leaving my office at home. So I don't actually go into work now, but I used to. Have you ever come home from work and said something like to whomever you may have at home or friends, "You'd never believe what happened to me today. Someone cut in front of me on the drive to work. Or someone got to the parking place that I had my eye on first. Or the guys at work laughed at Brad's joke more than mine." I don't work with anyone called Brad, nor am I saying everyone called Brad is funny, nor am I saying we should bear ill will toward people called Brad. But, you come home and you potentially look for, you feel like you have had some wrong done to you, even though it could have been some small, potentially petty issue, but you need to get this burning indignation, we might call it, off your chest. You need someone to perhaps validate your feelings for you. So, going to the other side of the room that Haman was in at the time, what was the family's reaction? What was the family's reaction? A moderate one. "Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it." Off with his head, essentially. So, there is a little bit of debate from a historical aspect, however grim this is, about whether or not the Bible is actually talking about a gallows for hanging or a spike for impaling, as would have been a common execution technique at the time, at that time in history. So, yeah, kind of grim, but that's an incredibly strong response to a guy that simply did not quake in his boots whenever you walked by. That's an incredibly strong response. Haman was willing to kill Mordecai, not because Mordecai thought that he was better than Haman, but simply because Mordecai did not recognize Haman as superior. And I think there's a difference between those two things. Just for a little bit of interesting tidbits, the 50 cubits that it mentions as the unit of measurement for how high the gallows should be, if you convert it to kind of modern measurements, that's about 75 feet or 23 meters. And if you want to imagine that in your head, the average kind of two-story UK house, I looked it up, about between 7 or 8 meters tall. So if you want to go to 23 or 24 meters, that'd be about 3 houses stacked on top of each other. Now, a lot of the times whenever you see gallows in movies, it's, twice the height of a man or something like that. But all of a sudden, a gallows that's 3 houses high. I mean, how are you going to get up there? I don't know, but that's, again, what are they saying there? What are they saying there? They're trying to communicate a message here, a message of pride, a message of punishing someone that they viewed as snubbing them. They wanted everyone to see what they did in retaliation, so that perhaps other people might go, ooh, this is what happens to the guy that snubbed Haman. I won't dare ever stay sitting down whenever Haman walks by again. And that continues to feed the pride of Haman. That continues to feed the validation that he craves from others. And I love how we mentioned that pride cometh before the fall. That kind of leads us into our next bit here. So if we continue on to chapter 6 now, kind of cools down the story a little bit, cools down the chronicle, swaps the character focus a little bit to the king. And it says in verse 1 that that night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It seems even at that point in history, reading someone to sleep would have been a common thing. Makes sense. So Persian kings at the time were known for their meticulous record keeping, so that's where this book of the records of the Chronicles would have come into play. And if we remember from the 2nd chapter of Esther, Mordecai informed on the two guys who essentially were plotting to kill the king. But the important thing that we kind of come to read now is when the king says in verse 3, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. Nothing has been done. Now I'm going to draw a little bit of a comparison now between Mordecai and Haman. If you perhaps put Haman in the shoes of Mordecai at this point, if Haman had been one to find that a couple of guys were plotting to kill the king, and he had informed on them, do you think Haman would have possibly been quiet and don't worry about letting the king know specifically that it was me that did it. As long as the king survived and we foiled the plot, all is good. Now, Haman probably would have gotten an entourage of 50 servants to lead him into the king's room and said, hey, it was me that did this for you. I saved your life. Surely, honor and dignity should be bestowed upon me for this because I deserve it. So a little bit of a comparison here. James chapter 4 verse 6 says, it's a short and sweet one, but I love it. It says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Again, I think that describes the comparison between the two men. And another one I like here, I think that's relevant. Picked out a couple little tidbits. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 6 says, therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. Due time, I think, is the difficult part of that verse. Due time, what could due time mean? Now, I'm no historian. I leave that to Bethany. But I did do a little bit of research. The prevailing thought is that about 10 years passes through the book of Esther, and that between the time that Mordecai saved the king's life to this point now would have been about 5 years. So due time in this particular instance might have been 5 years. So Mordecai saved the king's life 5 years ago, but not only did the king not read about it until now, presumably, because, Mordecai told Esther about it, but presumably Esther might still have been the only one that knew Mordecai might have actually been the one to do it, or she, however it got into the book of records there, at the very least, the king never heard about it. However that may have gone through. So, something important to mention, kind of in the timeline of this series of events. Even when the Jews were kind of put with their backs up against the wall from the order of Haman, Mordecai still did not come forward with this. And things may not have happened in the time or manner that those involved might have wished for. But does that mean the Lord was not looking out for them throughout all that? If Mordecai had made a big fuss, or had been rewarded at the time for saving the king from those would-be assassins, he would not have been set up in this particular time, at this crisis, to be used for the Lord's work for saving the Jewish people. Now, got a little bit of supplemental material here. What's another instance that we, obvious instance perhaps that we can think of where the Jewish people could have been pushed to the edge? World War II, I'm sure, is what crops up often in people's minds. I've got a book here. Not going to go massively into it, but this book is actually by he's a secular Jew. So he's not a Christian in any way, shape, or form. But this book is actually a response to a letter that kind of a very famous atheist wrote at the time. And essentially this atheist was, I think for all intents and purposes, Holocaust denying. For all intents and purposes, not only putting the blame on the Jews for the Holocaust, but using the Holocaust as a reason for God not existing. So the author of this book kind of puts a little bit of a rebuttal against that. This is in the aftermath of it all. He says, "The Jewish people yet live, and even in Eastern Europe, even in Poland, they have returned to their ancestral homes. But the 1,000-year Reich, that lies buried in the rubble of German cities, smashed to smithereens, or ground under Russian tank treads, or destroyed by American artillery, or left to wander in its exiled millions across all the violated borders of Central Europe. And if God did not protect his chosen people, precisely as Sam Harris, the atheist, might have wished, he did, and in excess of his old accustomed vigor, smite their enemies with generations to come in mourning or obsessed by shame." So I think we can possibly agree that the Jewish people are probably one of the most oppressed and beaten down people of all time. But does that mean that God was not there for them throughout all that time? Or that because that they might not have been saved or possibly protected in the ways that people might have wished for at the time? Does that mean that God was not there with them throughout all that? But I digress. Back to Esther. The king wants to reward Mordecai because he found out that nothing was done for the person who saved his life. So, the king's not going to do it himself. He's going to get someone from the court to come and do it for him. He's going to give the command. So, we see in verse 4 of chapter 6, "So the king said, 'Who is in the court?' Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Verse 5, the king's servant said to him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. In verse 6, so Haman came in, and the king asked of him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And that's a simple, I think, kind of clever question. It's a clever question. And what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? You know, who's he asking this to? He's asking this to Haman, a man so full of himself that, you know, it's his first thought that we see at the end of verse 6. Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? More than me. That's essentially being called into your boss's office, and your boss asks you, I'm going to give someone a bonus. How big do you think it should be? And you just got done completing a big project, and it's all gone successfully, and the customers are happy, and everything like that. And you go, well, now that you mention it, I could use a new car as well. So I think this person, should be given a big fat bonus, and they should get a car and the promotion, and everything comes along with it. But what do we see? What do we see then? If we come down to verse 10. And the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse. Give the bonus and the car, as you've suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. Give it to Brad. I wish that digital cameras could have been made at that time, so that we could have gotten a picture of Haman's face when the king said that. That'd be one of the situations that I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall, to witness all of that going on. All of that going on. And I didn't say this before, but my little subheader for this section is called the backfire. Called the backfire. And again, when we mention pride cometh before the fall, we've gotten to the fall. We have now arrived at the fall. So, if we read verse 11 again. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And possibly something it doesn't say there. Not only did Haman have to, I'm sure that there was no love lost between Mordecai and Haman. I'm sure that they were not the best of friends. So not only did Haman have to do this in front of someone that he was not friendly with, can you imagine how many people would have seen? How many of Haman's friends would have seen Haman lead through what he would have said is his sworn enemy through the city square, and how much whispering would have been done in the alleyways, thinking, oh, did you see what Haman just had to do? What a loser. What a loser. How much might that have hurt Haman's pride? So what does Haman do after that? We see what Mordecai does in verse 12. Mordecai goes back to the king's gate. His plan of action hadn't changed. But Haman left that day in high spirits, heading to go to the king to request Mordecai's death. But now he's gone back home, as we continue in verse 12, mourning and with his head covered, in complete and total shame. And in verse 13, when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but you will surely fall before him. What an incredible change of tone from the family and friends. What a change of tone. Just a little bit earlier, presumably, possibly, either that same day or very recent in time, they were saying, oh, that guy who snubbed you, let's execute him, let's kill him, off with his head. But now all of a sudden, oh, there's no way you can beat him. You've gone from second in command to there's absolutely no way that you're going to be able to beat this Jew. Absolutely no way. And the comment that they make here of Jewish descent, I think if you unpack that a little bit, they specifically mention the Jewish descent. It's clear that the Persians, at the very least, would have had some knowledge of the God that the Jews followed. They would not have been completely and totally ignorant of who God was. And the Persians of that day, they would have been fatalistic. So fatalistic being, they would believe that everything is predetermined, inevitable. They would have been believers in omens and signs, so that if something happened, if what they perceived to be as a sign, then that would have said, ooh, this communicates that to us. So this event of, for all intents and purposes, Haman being humiliated in front of everyone, they took that as an omen, as you're doomed. Essentially, if you try and fight against Mordecai. So quite the change in tone. So what? So what? What does all of this kind of mean for us? I think I've told this story before. In my second year of university, I kind of went to a competition in Germany. And at the end of it all, everyone had fairly high hopes of winning. But, we kind of did a trial run of the presentations that we'd be giving. And throughout the next 12 hours or so, the amount of people who came up to me and said, "Your guys, this was so good. So good. You guys have won this easy. Not a problem. You guys have won. You got it in the bag." That pride was being built up. That pride was taking root. It was starting to rot. You can probably tell, if anyone hasn't heard this story, you may be able to tell where this is going. Lo and behold, when they announced the winner, we didn't win. We got second place. Second place, now this was an international competition. We had people from different countries. It was in Germany. It was held at this big kind of technology expo. It was looking back on it, I didn't enjoy it at the time, but looking back on it, it was an incredible experience. How could I have been displeased with such an experience? But you want to know what I focused on? I focused on the fact that I didn't get first. Because I had built up in my mind. I had this picture in my mind. I've won. I deserve that first place. That should have been mine. And you know what? It ruined a lot of it. It ruined a lot. How on earth could I have been displeased with second place there? A quote that I like from one of my favorite authors. He says, "Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man." Pride is a spiritual problem. It is a purely spiritual problem. If we look at the Pharisees, how else could you describe them but as chiefly prideful men? But, I've said a lot about what pride is. But what is pride not? What is pride not, really? Pride is not thinking that you've done a good job. That is not pride. There is no pride in having been proud of doing a good job. It is prideful to only be happy if you have done the best job. The trouble begins when you pass from thinking, I've done a good job, all is well, to thinking, what a fine person I must be to have done a good job. I've mentioned in the past that the opposite of pride is humility. And if one wants to acquire humility, the first step is to realize that one is proud. The first step of the Alcoholics Anonymous program is realizing that there's a problem. Because they say that unless you realize that there's a problem, you're never going to come close to fixing it. And if you don't think that there's a problem, there most certainly is. I'm going to leave you with a verse now as we finish. Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 24. It says, "Let not the wise man glory in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man glory in his might, nor let the rich man glory in his riches. But let him who glories glory in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, exercising loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, says the Lord." So I think that what that tells us is that at the very least, at some point, your wisdom is going to fail you. Your might is going to fail you. Your riches are going to fail you. But God is not going to fail you. Ever. Ever. And there is no greater picture of that than what Christ did on the cross for us.